I want to make it clear that what I'm talking about relates to remote Australia. That's roughly the 18 to 20% who live in remote Australia particularly. It has some bearing to native title holders outside that area, of course, but that is the particular group of native title holders that I've got in mind. So as the paper is the native title funds and the public interest. As the preamble to the Native Title Act makes clear, the Act is a special measure for the advancement and protection of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders that is intended to enhance the process of reconciliation and to rectify the consequence of past injustice. As such, it has the intention of beneficial legislation while at the same time facilitating the recognition of property rights. These two do not sit together comfortably. Like the notion of a treaty or treaties, the idea of beneficial legislation raises a question that's not often asked in public as to what benefit non-Indigenous people will get out of such legislation or agreements. What's in it for us, non-Indigenous people? I don't think the answer is difficult to arrive at. In its ideal form, it would be all is forgiven, erasing the past as a basis for Aboriginal claims against the majority in the future. While this is easily said, it's probably unachievable, not least because to surrender the moral claims against the majority is to lose the most effective hold a small Indigenous minority has over the population at large. Even more problematically, there is no way that future generations can be definitively bound by what happens in this one. The limits to the claims of future Indigenous claims will come as the influential audiences for them declines. At the moment, the audience for Aboriginal claims are at a high point, although the continuing deferral of the referendum on constitutional issues seems to be partly based on uncertainty about the strength of that audience among the population at large, although, of course, this is not the most important delaying factor. If achieving all is forgiven situation is quite unlikely, then presumably the more achievable goals of meeting the requirements of natural justice, removing grounds for legitimate complaint, and helping people improve their circumstances are more likely and achievable. At the present time, a specific focus related to these goals is the concern with compensation, largely understood in financial terms. Although I know of no study of the expected numbers of native title holders to receive compensation, it seems safe to say that it will be a minority of native title holders, as there must be plenty of areas where there have been no compensable acts. But it is not just in this restricted area of native title that it is only a limited number of native title holders that benefit from recognition of their title, but more generally. Because of modern settlement patterns, native title holders are generally only a small proportion of co-residents in the same town or village. Typically in the Northern Territory, they are less than 10% of the population. Less than 10% of the population lives on its own land, even though more than 50% is held by Aboriginal people. So, for example, when rental payments were made to the Aboriginal landowners on which the settlements are built, most people missed out, and the payments have tended to be divisive. Broadly speaking, this same issue emerges on many occasions when native title holders' rights are recognized. They result in the disenfranchisement of the majority of the people in the same locality. This tendency is aggravated where money is concerned, as it leads to juridification and a proliferation of legal entities, fracturing a community in both of its senses, and the weakening of community-based organizations. Does that matter? Well, that depends. If you believe that the power of private property and keeping up with the Joneses are universal motivations for capital accumulation and engagement with the market economy, then the tensions created by the unequal distribution of funds in remote communities might seem to be what is needed to stimulate entrepreneurial activity and provide economic incentives to the population. While Aboriginal life in such communities is undergoing many changes, there are also deep continuities in socio-cultural orientations, as reflected in the nature of personal identity, social relations, and economic practices. There is a very extensive and thoroughly researched and evidence-based academic literature on this. Ignoring the deeply embedded socio-cultural differences makes no sense in the light of this evidence, nor does believing that they will disappear within the compass of a few years if the appropriate economic incentives from the point of view of mainstream thinking are provided. Any serious attention to life in remote communities since Aboriginal people entered the cash economy in 1969 or started collectively receiving substantial royalty payments in the 80s, would undermine this power of property view despite its prevalence among conservative politicians. There has been no capital accumulation in such communities because there are very powerful social forces preventing it. Even where a small group of native title holders receive hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in rental income in a community of many hundreds, if not thousands, the monies go to consumption, not accumulation. This is not a problem in itself, but what is problematic is the expectation that compensation and other monies will substantially improve things for other than a few, and the almost certain lack of lasting or wider benefit is benefiting the few and rarely ever achieving lasting transformation satisfactory. The unsatisfactory aspects of this situation are highlighted if one thinks that the federal government has or should have a fiduciary responsibility to Aboriginal people. 24 years ago, Mr. Justice Kirby expressed the opinion that whether a fiduciary duty is owed to the Crown by the Indigenous people of Australia remains an open question, and that still applies. The case for such a fiduciary responsibility can be made on several grounds, including the fact that Aboriginal people have been wards of the state for long periods, and that under land rights and native title legislation, their land is only alienable to the Crown. That is, the Crown has placed itself between Aboriginal people and the rest of us in order to protect them, and by that action taken on a fiduciary-like responsibility. Now, whether these or other points are of any legal significance is not important to the question I want to raise here, which is not so much whether the states and or the federal government have a fiduciary responsibility towards Aboriginal people, but if they did, what might we expect of them acting as a fiduciary in relation to native title issues? This is clearly a complex question, involving political, practical, and moral considerations. It also involves a question as to which one or more of the three branches of government the fiduciary relationship might apply, the executive, the legislature, or the judiciary, and brings us face to face with the uneasy mix of market and inalienable property relations enshrined in native title. While the recognition of native title was a huge leap forward for the nation and brings benefits to many Aboriginal people, it also disadvantages just as many, if not more, each time it's recognised, creating enduring conflicts and inequities. If recognising native title is unequivocally right, but for practical reasons unavailable for all, how could a fiduciary responsibility for those left out be met? Treaty making in particular offers state and federal governments one powerful way in which a fiduciary responsibility to include the excluded could begin to be exercised by government and balance out the parochial aspects of native title. Settlement should deal with the whole permanent resident indigenous population of a region, not just with the narrowest category of native title holder. And as an aside, it's concerning that in some political contexts, the phrase native title holder is used as synonymous with Aboriginal people, because it obscures this problem that I'm discussing. Benefiting the broader Indigenous population will only be addressed if all those involved in native title matters, anthropologists, lawyers, policymakers, community development workers, and particularly the Aboriginal leadership at both local and regional levels, keep this issue on the agenda, with both government and those privileged native title holders lucky enough to have their native title recognised. Lying behind this issue of compensation, royalties and rents flowing into remote communities is another difficult matter that gives rise to a public interest in these monies in the light of the benevolent aspiration of the preamble to the Native Title Act. Many well-wishers feel it's important to maximise the amount of these monies because of the poor living circumstances and low incomes in such communities. Certainly, people can and should benefit from them. But it's important to understand some of the consequences, the most important of these being that they intensify the prolonged dependency, leading one to ask, are there long-term forms of dependency that do not demoralize or deprive people of valued purpose in life and do not intensify the burden of living in worlds without work? The answer to this rhetorical question, I would say, in answer to this rhetorical question, I would say that they are hard to think of. Given the huge emphasis both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people place on the importance of finding jobs for people in remote communities, it's clear that it is a common view that long-term dependency is often associated with social problems. On the other hand, in the absence of the commitment to the notion of career and the disinclination of most people in communities adjacent to mines to sell their labour to them in any ongoing basis, it will take major changes in those communities before jobs become seriously relevant. A more profound difficulty that intersects with this issue is the general decline in the widespread engagement with formal education and a lack of interest in inquiring the competencies necessary to replace the non-Aboriginal people delivering most services. This means, among other things, that PBCs and remote communities more generally, with or without income, are and will be dependent for several generations on outsiders to help them manage their affairs. And of course, there's nothing absolutely wrong with them being dependent, working with outsiders, but it's this sort of wholesale dependency in a time of the rhetoric of self-determination. So far, the task of rep bodies has been to bring PBCs into existence through successful claims. It's clear that the current government sees a reduced role for them in the post-determination environment. Current policy is to leave PBCs free to choose their service providers on the open market. The argument is that if the rep bodies are offering a competitive service, the PBCs will choose them as their service provider. One does not have to be a skilled political analyst to see the motivation here. It's betrayed by the long-held attitude to the territory land councils and the constant attempts to weaken or dismember them. The current governments do not want rep bodies to turn into territory-like land councils. Politicians of both persuasions and others are sometimes irritated by the actions of land councils. Such large organisations can attract high-quality, well-qualified staff. They make efficient use of resources that would otherwise be split between many service providers, and they develop complex socio-cultural expertise. Equally importantly, they provide Aboriginal people with their own professional resources that are not only essential to the management and development of their assets, but also to representing their wider interests. It is this role in providing Aboriginal people with effective political voice that is objected to. Ironically, it is the larger mining companies that were long opposed to the land councils that in the end have come to see that there are some benefits in having such organizations. This issue of effective independent organizations goes to the heart of what it takes to make land rights and native title make a difference. Properly funded, large professionally trained staff dedicated to the task. If we want to ensure native title can bring benefits to remote regions and to the under-resourced as well as the well-resourced native title holders or PBCs, then we need land council-like rep bodies to make it work. It is therefore in the interests of us all that NTRBs are made the default service providers to PBCs in their regions, so that they get good advice from organizations that are not simply seeking to make money out of them, but to ensure that they get the best advice to the benefit of us all, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. If a PBC wants to go it alone, they should have to make the case for seeking independent service providers. And we're all well aware that the motivation for independence is often highly problematic and closely linked to the emergence of localism and the problems that we have been discussing here yesterday. Native title is very much an artifact of our culture and legal system, with only tenuous links to life before 1788. That, of course, is exactly as it should be. Trying to restore the pre-1788 situation would make no sense, least of all in terms of how the land might be held or how it could articulate with the encompassing market economy. As a result, native title ends up being a curious hybrid. Aboriginal people do not get the full benefits of property ownership as understood in mainstream Australia, nor do their rights relate closely with what happened in the past. So native title is already fashioned by the public interest. If rep bodies become simply another regional service provider, not only will there often be organizational money problems, which have already emerged, but it will be difficult to leverage many of the benefits from native title for the population at large. Further, there will be a decline in the quality of the staff that the rep bodies can attract to work for remote Aboriginal people. And Aboriginal people would lose one of the few professionally resourced bodies they have to help them formulate and promulgate their regional interests. If PBCs had to work through fully funded rep bodies, the collectivity of native title holders would get better and more ethical service, access to a wider range of services, such as community development at regional cost, and have well-resourced organizations with intercultural expertise to deal with problems. Other Australians would not only get better value for money, but be confident that they were properly empowering the native title holders to represent and exercise their interests. The alternative is the economics of abandonment, which is basically where things are going. Remote Aboriginal people, as less than 20% of the Aboriginal population, are unlikely to have a very strong voice in any future voice to Parliament. And they are likely to be easily drowned out if they do not have their own professional organizations. And I think the situation will only be aggravated in the Territory as the royalty equivalent streams decline over the next 10 years and the land councils have to scale back, leaving remote Australia with only a hoarse whisper in the corridors of power. Thank you.